Well, welcome to the Lookouts training session, Hope-Filled Engagement with Gray Poehnell. My name is Sarah Kift, and I'm your host for today. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about this training project. This is a Housing First readiness project, and the Lookout Society partnered with Douglas College to do a needs assessment with programs across Metro Vancouver in order to develop training that is relevant and timely. And this project is funded in part by the Government of Canada's Homelessness Partnering Strategy. Today, we not only have our instructor, Gray Poehnell, but we also have Susan Keeping with us, who will be adding some perspective and case studies from frontline shelter and outreach work. So let's meet Gray. Gray is an experienced career consultant with an interest in practical spirituality, creativity, imagination, and career integrity. As partner to Dr. Norm Admonson in Ergon Communications, he has participated in the development and writing of numerous career counseling programs and has co-authored several books and workbooks. Gray is of Métis descent and is presently involved in projects to develop career materials from an Aboriginal perspective and to train Aboriginal career practitioners across Canada and in Australia with the Guiding Circles approach. He is happily married, has 2 adult daughters, and currently lives in beautiful Steveston at the mouth of the Fraser River. And now for the other lovely voice you'll be hearing at the microphone today, Susan Keeping. Susan is the Regional Manager for Housing First with the Elizabeth Fry Society of Greater Vancouver. She has 26 years of experience working in the sector with vulnerable women, families, and individuals dealing with poverty and homelessness, including managing the Housing First programs, a key of her own, and the Surrey Housing First Collaborative since January of 2015. And Susan is going to start things off before turning it over to Gray. So welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you here. And over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to say how excited I am to be part of this learning. I think that when we work in the community, and I hear from many of the people working with chronic and episodically homeless individuals, they feel that hopelessness is a common factor. And when we're working day after day, it's hard for us to have that kind of hope and to impart that hope to them when they have lost all hope. So I'm really excited to hear the presentation, and I'm hoping to bring some case histories and question how we would then apply the practice.
And welcome, Gray. It's wonderful to have you here this morning.
Thank you, Susan, and also Sarah. And it is a joy to me to talk with you about the concept of hope and how that can work in the offices that you do, in the lives that you interact with, and maybe for yourself personally. Because what I've found over the years of training is that many times, as I talk about hope, the workers who I engage in my workshops and trainings and teachings, they walk away with a much greater sense of hope than when they first started. And I hope that's the case for you today. Hope has been a central part of my life, both professionally and personally. And all that I do really has evolved from the intertwining of those. And I've come to the belief that hope is a core competency that we have to develop in our lives as we work with people, especially if we're working with people with challenges in some way. Many times, we're working with people who are very, very hopeless, and it's our role to come alongside with them and sometimes hope for them when they can't hope for themselves. And so I hope as we go through this today that I can share some things that will be of real help to you in that end. Professionally, as has been mentioned, I work with Dr. Norm Admonson, and over the years, since 1989, I have had the privilege and the joy of working all across Canada, from Haida to the Maritimes, up throughout the Arctic. And I've literally done hundreds of workshops with thousands of people in diverse situations, many of them people with real barriers and difficulties. I've had, as was mentioned, extensive work throughout Australia, New Zealand, even Europe, because there's a growing understanding that there are many people who don't necessarily understand a lot of what's done in the mainstream and need alternative approaches. And that's what we're going to be looking at, it's an alternative approach to some of what's done in mainstream. This has also been a personal journey for me. I am a Métis, And these are my great-great-grandparents in the Red River Colony. My mom was a Francophone Métis who left school when she was 11 and moved to Vancouver where she had to learn English. She got married at 16, had 5 of us in the next 10 years or so. And although my mom really was a wonderful mom and did all she could to give us a wonderful childhood, we still had a lot of dysfunctionality and problems and difficulties. Many of my uncles struggled with alcohol abuse, had their children taken away because of substance abuse, and we lived ourselves in a lot of abject poverty, especially when we were young, housing issues. This is my brother and I. I'm the shy one. At this point, Mom had 4 of us and a bun in the oven, and we lived in South Vancouver in the basement of a house where we had no running water. She had to go get water, and this was our bathtub. And of course, in Vancouver, people live in pretty rough situations, and that's how I grew up. And as you could tell, as I already mentioned, I was very shy, and it got worse and worse for me as I went to school. And school was a difficult place for me. I'm the little shrimpy kid on the opposite bottom corner from the teacher. And right away in grade 1, I was being recognized as a child who wasn't paying attention. I was disengaged. Part of it is that I'm visually impaired, and that caused lots of problems in school. I also had speech difficulties that eventually I got help with in grade 5. I had learning disabilities and struggled with learning a lot of the stuff that I was being taught, and there were a lot of reasons for that. But in grade 4, I kind of had a defining moment where a lot of what was happening to me was kind of crystallized. I had one of those teachers, maybe you had one of them, a teacher from hell, although when I look at the size of her class, I think there's 42 students there. Maybe I have to be a little bit more gentle with her. But she saw me as a young kid who just wasn't working hard enough. Because I could do, especially arithmetic, she thought I just wasn't trying in things like in language and stuff because I couldn't speak well, I couldn't read, I couldn't spell. And one day she found out that I didn't know how to spell my name, and so she figured the way to solve that was told me to go in front of the class to the board and start writing and keep writing until I spelt my name correctly. Unfortunately, after an hour not succeeding, I got an hour detention, spent another hour, still couldn't spell my name, and eventually she sent me home with a note to my mom asking what was wrong with me, that I couldn't spell my name in grade 4. And maybe you've had experiences like that. I know I've met many other people who've had these kind of experiences that kind of burn deep in their heart that there was something wrong with them, that they were different, that they didn't fit. And that was certainly my case. And I came to believe that, and my shyness became very crippling, very much a crippling introversion. But I kept going to school because my dear mom saw that as the way out of our family difficulties, because she thought if we got educated, we could move away from all of these problems. And so I kept going to school. Eventually I went to the University of British Columbia and to go to mathematics because I could do arithmetic. Unfortunately, they told me I was functionally illiterate, but they let me in because of my good grades in math. And except for almost failing first year English, I didn't take any more arts courses because I was convinced that I was stupid. My self-talk revolved around the fact that I was a loser. I thought I was a retard, and part of my language for that. But that's what I thought, because inside I still struggled with who I was, etc. But just before my last year of university, I came to a crisis where this going to university, fulfilling my mom's dream, was in total conflict with who I thought I was inside as this loser. And I almost had a breakdown over it. And I went through a long process that summer of looking at things, and I decided I did not want my life to continue the way it was. It was hard enough going through it once. Why would I want to keep reliving it the rest of my life? And I dealt with spiritual issues, other issues, and I decided that I'd find some way to turn my life around. To make a very long story short, what happened after that is I finished university, worked for a year as a mathematician, a statistician, then went back to 4 more years of schooling in which I found out I'd have to take 4 years of English. I almost didn't go because of that, but I thought I'm going to find some way to learn this language. And when I graduated 4 years later, I was approached by that college to come on faculty one of the things I was asked to do was to teach English. I later became chairman of their English department, and then their language department, and I became a Greek teacher. And I was there for 17 years altogether. And this personal journey moved from me being an illiterate loser in my mind to a mathematician to ultimately a Greek teacher. And since '89, I left my teaching work because I wanted to be involved in people and helping people practically. And so I've become a career consultant. Now I'm a trainer, an author, and I've learned a fundamental thing that influences the way I work with everybody I meet, no matter whether it be in an urban, a rural, or a really remote situation in Canada or overseas somewhere, is that how we start doesn't predetermine how we have to finish. And that's what hope is all about. So hopefully this will help. Why hope? Very simply, it's because I find that so many feel like they are trapped. They're boxed in what we call a crisis of imagination. They can't see behind the box. Their life realities, their limitations and possibilities are such that they lose sight of any possibilities. All they have is their limitations. That's what I was like. I'm visually impaired. I can't talk well. I can't read. I'm shy. I can't stand being in front of people. And that became the way I viewed myself and my life. And I developed a real sense of hopelessness. If it wasn't for the hope of my mom encouraging me to keep going, I would have given up. But I've come to see that being boxed in is really an opportunity for imagination. That is, I could take that very same box that I felt trapped with and use that as a building block for hope. I can use that as a starting point of new possibilities. In fact, in my own life, all of those limitations that so crippled me for so long in my life, well into my 20s, they become the very things that enabled me to be effective as I work with other people who have struggled with multiple barriers. So what I want people to understand is that right now you're probably watching a computer or listening to this in some way, and you're in a room, but even though you're in that room, in your mind, you could be wandering, and you could be going into your kitchen and getting something to eat and sitting down and eating it, all in your mind, even though you're not there. And that's because you have been given the gift of imagination. That is the ability to see things, experience things that aren't where you are right now. I believe that God has given that to all of us because that is what enables us to hope. You see, hope at its simplest level is seeing something that we don't have. If I've already got it, I don't need to hope for it. But imagination enables us to reach out of our life circumstances to something that we hope for. And I believe we have the ability to believe in that. And as we believe in that, that is what motivates us. That is what moves us. That's what enables us to step out and try. But you may be like some people that I encountered who say, yeah, but you don't know my life. I don't have any hope. I've lost faith. I have no imagination. Just let me ask you a simple question. Do you ever worry? Do you ever fear? Because when we worry or fear, what are we doing? We are imagining. We are looking outside of our current circumstance to something in the future that hasn't happened yet, and it becomes very real to us in our mind. We can see it. We can feel it. And what's also true is that though people think they've lost faith, the reality is they have not lost faith. They've just transferred it to their fears because they believe those fears. They believe those worries. It's like it's real to them. And if you fear, if you worry, you have shown yourself that you have the capacity to hope. That is, you have and are experienced in the ability to see something in the future that has not yet happened yet, that is outside of your time space right now. And you've shown that you have the ability to believe that and to allow that belief to influence how you think, how you feel, the choices that you make, and the actions that you take. You have shown that you have been hardwired for hope. It's there. The challenge is moving our imagination, moving the thinking, moving the way we look at our lives away from that fear, those worries, to hope and possibilities. And that's done by creating an environment that is more hopeful. And so in the work that I do with the clients that I work with, whether they be directly with clients and do a lot of work directly with multi-barrier people, or if it's the counselors that I'm working with, I want to create an environment so that when they meet with me, everything I do with them creates a sense of hope for them that they can seize hold of and grab. The question is, how do we make this practical? Because it's easy to talk about hope, but just be, you know, an airy-fairy thing with no practicality. And so how do I make hope practical? This is a picture of a hill city in Provence called Gourd last fall of 2015. My wife and I had the privilege of spending a week in a house there up near the top of the hill, fortunately, to celebrate her retirement. An absolutely beautiful city, built centuries ago out of stone. And one of the fascinating things about it is all the stone stairs. They're absolutely stunning when you see them. And you can see how these have been worn away after centuries of people walking on them. But I couldn't help but thinking about, what about if somebody had a wheelchair? And here you have these stairs that have worked effectively for most people for centuries. If somebody comes along with a wheelchair, those very stairs become a barrier because it means this inaccessibility. And in our world today, we build facilities with ramps, not just stairs. Even though stairs work for most people, we know we have to make a ramp for the person in the wheelchair. But it's not just physical structures that can be barriers to people. Sometimes it's our whole thought process, the way we do things can be just as much a barrier, make things just as inaccessible as stairs do to a wheelchair. For example, we talk about in the mainstream about people having education, a job, a career, having a family, security, a house, success, and it sounds so good. But if somebody's life is a long way away from that, and I've been a long way away from that, those very things do not seem like something that are mine. That is not my life. That does not fit me. And rather than being something hopeful, it actually is something that seems very hopeless. And so what I have to do is find some way to help a person find hope as they look in that direction. And there's many ways that I do it. One way that I do it is very simply this. I often use physical activity because that's easier for people to learn with than talking a lot of words. And if you take just a moment and turn away so you look completely away from your screen, maybe so your back's to your screen. And you can probably, hopefully, still hear me. But let me ask you this. While you're looking, to the opposite wall from where your screen is, can you see the screen? Can you see this PowerPoint presentation? Well, probably not. And when I ask people, why can't you see me? I'm here. That screen is there. Why can't you see it? Most people realize, well, it's because I'm looking in the wrong direction. And this happens to people. We look at people from this model of who a person is supposed to be and how we can help them and what life's about. And we look to this area, but they're not there. That's not their life. So when we look there, we, in effect, make that person invisible because we're looking where they're not. And there are lots of reasons why in our mainstream systems there's issues of diversity, because a lot of this stuff was designed really on a North American business model, a salesman model, where you get to know yourself, you go and you sell yourself to the world, and you get all this stuff. But there are a lot of people who come from a very different world than that mainstream world. And starting points, we often start with points that people don't have. And so it just makes them feel more hopeless. Education, I often use that because if you were to talk to my dear mom about education, because she left school at 11, if you talk to anybody ever brought up that topic, her head would go down and she'd turn embarrassed and she'd go, I know I'm not educated, I know I'm nobody. And all that did was bring up hopelessness and fear and failure for her. That was no starting point to talk to my mom. And so we have to watch our starting points. And it could be that oftentimes we expect people to come in with what we call positive focused self-reflection. Tell me about yourself. What are you interested in? Well, to do that, people have to have looked at their life, looked at these matters, and seen the good things. But sometimes, if you're like I was when I was young, all I had was negative focused self-reflection. All I knew was how to see the negative things. And not only that, enculturated humility. I didn't think I was good enough for most of this stuff because I thought I was a retard. And I meet so many people when we talk about these things, they say, yeah, that's for other people. I'm not good enough. And they have enculturated humility where they believe that it can't be for them. And so what I want to do is, how do I turn that around? Because if I start at those traditional places that work for so many people, I start with some other people, if that's not their life, it has the opposite effect. It makes them feel like they don't matter. It makes them feel like they are no good. It makes them feel like they are a failure. And it certainly makes them feel like they're hopeless. And so what we have to find some way to do is to turn our attention by maybe changing our language, tools, processes, concepts, and developing a variety of language, tools, and processes and concepts that I can find ways not just to reach a person by looking at these mainstream concepts, but looking at them and finding things that help them where they are, seeing where they're engaged in life, where their life is at, and starting there, helping them, making this accessible. And so, for example, if I broaden this out and take it from a little box in the corner, with many people I never talk about education because it is threatening to them. But I say, tell me something you've learned. I found that everybody has learning and knows far more. In fact, many times learning is much more valuable than education is. Somebody may not have goals and stuff, but they may want some form of fulfillment. They may never have had a job in their life, but they've taken on many life roles. And by broadening my language, changing my tools, I found I have been able to connect with, to help people feel like they count, and to engage them in ways that they're surprised by, because I'm learning to see them. So this is an alternative approach. Other approaches are really good, and I want to emphasize this. There are lots of approaches. The more approaches you learn, the more diversity of people you'll be able to work with, but this is one alternative approach to help people multi-barriered. And what I try to do very simply is bring hope into their current situation. I don't want them to think that in order for me to help you, you've got to change, because the fact is they need hope where they're at, not once they've changed.
I think it's time to just check in for a minute with our participants here, and this might be a difficult question for you to answer. We're just going to run it as a poll, but it helps to really locate you in this learning today, and think about the places where you deal with hopelessness, so that as we go through the workshop today, you can start to think about ways that you can shift that situation, because sometimes it's really big. It's this huge concept, so we're just going to get you to narrow it down a little bit so that we can experience some good learning here today. So I'm going to launch this poll, and the question is simple. It's just, where do you deal with hopelessness? It looks like you can only choose one, and I know that for a lot of us that there are multiple places, but for the purpose of this question, we just want you to pick one. So at work, at home, in your personal life, with clients, and in relationships. And I know for me, I've been through lots of different contexts. I've definitely experienced hopelessness at work and at home. Also at different times in different relationships, both with family and friends and loved ones and partners. And it's especially difficult when you're dealing with clients who have experienced a lot of hopelessness as well. I worked for 5 years in the downtown east side, and there were days where it was hard to get out of bed, for sure. So we really appreciate you checking in with us right now. Thanks so much to everybody. And we're just going to share the results of this. So it looks like a lot of us is specifically to do with our clients. So that's something that Gray can probably address as well as Susan as we go along. And also at work. Hopelessness at work is a big deal.
So how do we do this? Well, one of the things I've been asked to look at are some elements that help people develop hope. There's many things that influence people's sense of hope. Obviously, we can't talk about them all in the time we have today, but I've been asked to talk about the concept of mattering, helping people feel that they matter. And this is something that is really important because mattering matters. My colleague Norm Amundsen looks at mattering as this fundamental belief that people have that really somebody notices them, cares for them, appreciates them, and basically that they recognize that people are there. They can see them. And this is something that a lot of people are lacking. And so I always encourage workers to listen for the language, especially that indicate that people don't think they matter. What difference does it make what I do? So what? Who cares? That's just the way it is. It's never going to change. What's the use? There's no point of trying. Why should I bother? Because what I do isn't going to make a difference. And when people are saying things like this, they are in a mode that ultimately leads them to feeling that they don't matter as a person, that there is no hope, and so why bother trying? And this becomes a real barrier when we work with people, because if they're in that mindset, anything we suggest to them is already always blocked by this, why try it? Why bother? And so I find I need to often address this matter very quickly. Being somebody who went through sciences in university, I know that the concept of matter is something substantive, something that's tangible, something that's visible and I can handle and touch. Well, in a sense, there's parallel things when we talk about mattering. That is, people have to be visible and be recognized. We often talk from two directions. One is that somebody has value, they matter, they're important, they're significant, they have meaning intrinsically. That is because of who they are. But I found out with most people I have to go another step beyond that, because that sounds good in theory, but what happens if I don't feel like I can make a difference? Mattering must move to the point that a person feels like not just that I matter intrinsically, but I can do something that matters. It'll make a difference in my life, maybe in the lives of the people that are close to me, around me. And if we don't do this, we end up with invisible people, invisible to themselves and invisible to others. And I love this song from the musical of Chicago of Mr. Cellophane Man, where Amos, who's feeling totally unseen by his wife, is singing about how people can do things to be noticed. Like if you call fire in a theater, people are going to notice that. They're going to listen to it. And people notice even a little hen clucking around, unless that person is invisible and consequential me. And so he's Mr. Cellophane Man. Or he talks about how we have bulk and we got a physical body, and so we got a voice, and that should be seen and heard, unless we are unimpressive and undistinguished cellophane. And many people are like this. There was an ad a few years ago put out by the Salvation Army where they said, we see what most don't. And I love this ad because it sets forth what I think one of the fundamental things that we do for people, and that is we see what most don't. Oftentimes we see in their lives what they can no longer see and what the world around them no longer sees. And our job is to help them see what they see, to make them visible. I want the people that I interact with to feel like they have value, not just intrinsically, but they can actually do things that will make a real difference for them and for the people around them. And so I want to just talk quickly about some things in terms of cross-training, things that you can do to help people become visible, to help people realize that they matter, to help bring people a sense of hope. What is the butterfly effect? And I always like to talk about this. And you maybe have heard about this in the weather that, if a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon, it'll cause a tornado in the southern U.S. The fact that when we do small things, they can have a profound effect on the world around us. Originally, this was called sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which is a fancy way of saying that even small, seemingly insignificant changes at the start of a process can produce significantly different results.
So, Gray, I'd like to interject here and make this relevant, so the practical experience on the ground. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to review. You talked about hope, you talked about being present, and you talked about some other tools, and I'm wondering if you could describe how you would use them in this scenario. So you're working with a male individual, and he has been off and on homeless for most of his life. He might have been in care. He's probably in his 30s, and he's been mostly homeless. He may have done what he would call working for himself, or he's a scrap metal worker, where really it is, we know what that is for most of us. He has what could be looked at as possible mental health issues, although he talks about having stomach problems. He may talk about certain things which might relate, what we translate into anxiety, and he has some addictions. He's also a target for where people have stolen his wallet. He seems to be a kind-hearted soul, but he's really street entrenched, and he can't, like, people have stolen everything from him. He's having trust issues. It just goes on and on. So how would you use these tools for this individual who's feeling quite hopeless?
As the PowerPoint slide I have, a small change makes a big difference. I believe the first thing I would do is I would make a small but significant change in the way I even meet that person initially. Because I believe that my first contact should be one that engenders hope for a person. And the way that I do that, kind of relating to what I've already said, is I try to meet that person in such a way that I find out who they are and their story. I don't start by looking at what's gone wrong. I don't start by looking at what they should be like according to our culture, our society. But we usually start by talking about things. What are some of your favorite things in life? Because what we have found is when we look at that, I find where people are engaged, who they really are shows up. And some incredible things there. For example, you mentioned that he was somebody who's kind of been, in a sense, quote, quote, self-employed. And he's worked with metal. And maybe he's somebody who collects and sells metal in different ways. But even in doing that, when I get people to talk about those places where they're engaged, their whole face changes, because this is where there's, in a sense, if I may use this in the sense, that they're succeeding in that. They're doing something that's meaningful to them. They feel like they're accomplishing something, and I will unpack stories about that. Once I've got that sense of helping them see all the wonderful things that that person is doing, even while they collect that metal, then I can help them see how that can fit to other parts of their life. For example, my notice of many people who live on the street is some of those people work harder than people who have 8 to 5 jobs. They work way harder. They work longer hours. They're more disciplined. Many of them have very disciplined routes that they follow, and they create their own rules and infrastructure of what they do. And many times they do all that they need, but they do not see that as significant, because they're looked at, when people walk by in the street and see them, they look down on them. So what they see, they see themselves in the eyes of that other person as a failure, and what they're doing being a failure. I want them to see themselves in their own eyes of what they're really doing and the value of it. And just starting there, we have noticed has made a huge difference for a lot of people. And people have said to me, well, this makes sense because this is about me, and then building from that. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, But one of the things I really liked what you said is about being present.
Yes.
And so often in our busy worlds and everything that we're supposed to do, you know, we have to do data entry, we have the funder, we have our boss, we have, you know, work that we may have to do if we work in a facility where we actually have to do like hand out food or clean floors or, you know, monitor how many people have showers and be able to manage that. So we're doing all this work, and at the same time we want to instill hope and be present for the individuals that we're trying to help. And sometimes it feels like we lose hope because we're bailing with a leaky bucket.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is because we're being driven by goals rather than the simple goal of my time with this, maybe it's the first visit with this person, is to be able to show that person they matter. That may be the way I look them in the eye, to where I get up and greet them. If I was in a business world, a businessman would get up and greet that person at the door. They would ask them about, would they like something to drink, you know, etc. How's your day been? And I should treat everybody the same way. Whenever I have an office, a fundamental thing that I do is I never sit across from a person in a desk. A desk, to me, when I grew up, was a threatening thing because usually I was in the office being told I wasn't doing something right. And so I believe that even the way I meet a person, the way I look them in the eye, the way I greet them, the first questions that I ask, and how I stay focused on that person, listening to what they say. And I want them to realize that I'm actually listening to them. I had an experience just a couple of years ago. I was working with some troubled youth in a school situation where there's a bunch of youth, and I presented in the morning. In the afternoon, there was a big presentation by the Minister of Education in that area where I was, and it was right after lunch, and I was sitting and then up came two young ladies. One was a Muslim young girl, the other was a young African girl, and they wanted to take a picture with me. And I can remember they were so shy, so withdrawn. You know, you could just see the whole thing. Oh, you know, I'm a woman, I don't matter. And so I said, fine. Just then another teacher comes and grabs me and says, "Oh, you got to come right now. The minister wants to meet you before the afternoon meeting." And I said, "Excuse me, I have a picture with these girls right now." "No, you have to come now. This is really important." And I looked at the teacher in the eye, and I looked at the girls, and I said so they could hear, these girls are what is important right now, not that Minister of Education. And I said, "I'll come when I'm finished with," and they took it, and they were so happy. But, you know, it would have been so easy to be pulled away by that teacher, as if the important person were that other person. And no matter what the situation, I had to find some way to show that that person has my undivided attention and care and concern. That's what mattering is about.
And you know, it's interesting. It makes me think about the work that I did. So I did something fairly straightforward, but also lots of pressure, and that was serving people lunch.
Yes.
And sometimes there was a huge lineup. And what I worked hard at when I realized that this was a good thing, making sure people mattered, was I would try to remember people's names. And even if there were 200 people in line behind them, all I had to do in that moment was look that person in the eye, find out their name if I didn't know it or remember it, and ask them, "What can I get for you today?" And just taking that time to do that, let them know that they had my undivided attention. Even if it was only for 30 seconds while I got them a cup of coffee, it mattered. And it changed the way that I interacted with our clients, and it changed my heart as well. Because it also helped me to fight back that urgency. You know, when you work in an agency where everything is always an emergency, those things can bleed into the way that you treat people.
Yes.
Because you're always, like you said, this is more important, you've got to run here, we've got to interrupt. But actually, it's not a huge deal to actually just take a couple of seconds and connect and look that person in the eye. So thank you both for the examples and the teaching here. And back to you, Gray.
And this is a good illustration of small change, big difference. Because many times we think in order to be more effective with our clients, I'm looking for governments or others to make all kinds of big changes. I can't wait till they make all those big changes. I have to make small changes in what I do. And it takes no more time to look somebody in the eye and to smile and to treat them like a person than to sit there and treat them as if they're a client, a number. It takes the same time, small change, incredible difference. And maybe in your own life, think back on when people have made small changes that have made a big difference in your own life. Or think of people you've worked with where you just made a little tweak and it made a difference. It might be the way even you set up your office, the way you greet people, things like that can be very, very simple. And then move on from there. Possibilities. This is something that I try to shift so they can see possibilities, because I believe that hope finds practicality when I'm talking about real possibilities. Zander and Zander in the book Out of Possibilities have some wonderful stuff in this. I've adapted it. But they talk about people who feel trapped with their problem, and they become like a dog tethered to a stake who just goes around and around that problem. And you hear them when you talk with them, and you suggest something and you get, yeah, but, what I call the yeah, buts. And it's, yeah, but you don't understand my life. You don't understand my family. You don't understand my background. You don't understand my disability. And they go round and around and around that. And that can become such a habit that it becomes like a whirlwind that they live with. And unfortunately, at the center of every whirlwind is a vacuum. And this kind of approach to life, I can't because, yeah, but, can be such a way of life that it sucks life out. But the reality is we all live with our limitations of some form or another. I'm visually impaired. And there is the reality of many things that I cannot do because I'm visually impaired. I can't drive. I have a hard time reading things, etc. And those aren't going to change. That's my reality. And no amount of, believing is going to change those realities. But my reality is more than my problems. This also can be good in that. In my case, I can marry somebody who loves to drive and has driven me all around the world. I can't see print very well, but I can buy magnifying glasses and other things to help me to see. And what I find is that instead of being staked to the ground to my problem, I can help people see that in that reality I can explore. So it's true that I can't do some things because I'm visually impaired. But what can I do even though I'm visually impaired? And explore that. And sometimes when I do that, I found I've been able to live with those possibilities and break right out of those things. Because sometimes when I test those walls and go to them and say, well, wait a minute, this wall just says I can't do it. Sometimes I found that they are solid. Like, I'm visually impaired, that's not going to change. But some are glass and can be broken and should be broken. And some are rubber and you can bend those rules. And maybe you've bent a few rules in your life, in your reality. Diversity improv is another thing that I have to look at. And I like to talk about this because diversity is the new reality in our world today. With people aware of. This is a picture from a group I was working with in Newlanboy in northern Australia, in a very remote, difficult community. And I asked people, who's the diverse person here? Well, the reality is I am. I may look like the mainstream person, but I'm outside of their world. And in another sense, we're all diverse. We're all different. We're all unique. And in our field, and the work I work in, we talk about clients, life, career practitioners, the chaotic world of work. All of that's diverse. And we draw these nice, neat circles, where we work is where those intersect. But the fact is, it's not nice, neat circles, is it? These things are kind of chaotic and moving. They're like amoeba and they're changing all the time. And I'm working in that center part, trying to, as I'm changing, as I'm learning, as I'm growing, dealing with my life stuff, I'm trying to work with people who are struggling and their life is changing and they're dealing with things. And I've got the world of life and work and I've got government stuff about housing and stuff that's changing all the time. And I have challenges of chaos and complexity and change and confusion and uncertainty and even injustice. And yet I've got to find a way to work there because I've assumed and I want to take responsibility for where these intersect. And I want to do the best I can to provide the most effective help possible, even those other things are there. And again, I believe I can't wait till all that's better. I've got to do something now. And this is where I use improv. And we often think of improv and things like improv comedy, whose line is it anyway, or jazz improv, where these people just do incredible stuff. But we have to understand something very important about improv is about much more than comedy or jazz. It's from a Latin word meaning not foreseen or not provided. And it really, at the bottom line, means to make do with whatever materials are at hand. How many times have you had to do that in your life? Where somebody's come along and you had to make do, and you made it happen. You were improving. And we know that life is like jazz. And jazz is best when it's improv, and life is best also when it's improv. Because like improv, most of our life is unscripted. But we've all been hardwired with it. Look at every child. These are my daughters about 40 years ago when they were a lot younger. And you give them a bucket and a piece of paper, and they're on a pirate adventure. And they can just do that without even thinking. They're improving. Every sports game is an improv. They may have all their plans, their rules, practices, but when they get on that field, they don't know what's going to happen the next second. The improv. Every conversation you have with somebody is an improv. Every client you interact with is an improv, because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. You may have, well, I should do this with them during this hour, but you don't know what it's going to be like when they come in that door, what they're going to say, what you have to say back. You have to improv. Second City Communications, which does a lot in improv in the comedy world, but they have a huge business training business people to do improv. They talk about the ability to deal with the unexpected in a way that is positive. And I know from working with multivariate people that your day is full of dealing with the unexpected, isn't it? And the question is, how can we make that positive? And it accepts that though we can't fully predict what's going to happen, we have to be open to whatever comes and walk that journey of adventure and exploration as we find a way to help the person that I'm working with. And so I put improv at that center part. And again, we're all hard with it. So the question is, how do I intentionally nurture this ability that I already have, that I do every single day, but maybe nurture it so I can be more effective with it with the people I work with? We've got to understand what improv isn't. A lot of people have these ideas of improv just doing whatever you want. But if you look at, for example, the way people prepare for comedy improv or jazz improv, or even the way sports people prepare to play a game, they practice and practice and practice and practice, and they have rules, but they've got to take them and play with them then. And there's a balance here between contingency and constraint. Constraints is that box, and you may have, because of your funding or whatever, goals, objective rules, ways you're supposed to do it, and that's that box. Maybe you have to work with 1-hour meetings with your client, but you want more freedom to be creative, to explore, to play. Well, the fact is, these things are not separate realities. The fact is, these are realities every day. We live both of them. And the question is, what do I bring with it? I have an hour with this person. That's true. So how can I be creative in this hour with them? And so I have the discipline of preparation and practice to deal with, the stuff I've got to do, the rules, etc. But I want to combine that with intuitive risk-taking and creativity and flexibility in what I do. And that sets me free to be innovative and to adapt to whatever client comes in. So some things to cultivate. And I'm going to go through these very quickly. There's more on these slides than I have time to cover, but I think that there are things that you can look at and learn more on your own. A realistic perspective. First of all, I think we have to realize that the most realistic thing I have to do is I have to help that person before me. I have to keep that as my clear vision, because it is so easy to be muddied by all the other rules and regulations, things we think we've got to do. My role is that person that's being present with them, that's showing that they matter. I've got to accept that they're going to be different, and I've got to be willing maybe to go to new and unexpected places as I help that person. And I may have to step out of my comfort zone to do it. And that's realistic. And the more we work with people who are struggling with real-life situations, the more we have to accept this is the reality of what we do. Reflective practice. That is, I've got to develop self-awareness of what I'm doing and how others are aware of me. I've got to see whether that other person is whether I'm turning them off or whether I'm upsetting. I've got to ask myself those questions to look to see, am I doing something that could be making this more difficult for my client? Am I really being effective here? And maybe I've got to accept some of the discomfort of challenge and change to grow. Reflective. What helps you to be reflective in your work and life? Are the things that you do that make you able to see better what you're doing, how effective you are, and to see how good your relationship with the client is? What are some things that you do?
I'd be curious, Susan, considering the experience you've had and the work you've done, what your answer to this question would be.
Well, I think I start every day as a new day. I know lots of creative people that paint with, paint and watercolors, or they fabricate things, and in my mind I'm being creative by seeing how I can use the tools that I've learned in 26 years with the individual I meet that day. So every day I start new. I never lose hope. I'm the eternal hopeful individual, and so I try to just approach that in an open-minded way, so that depending on what that person is saying to me that day, I can then reflect something back to them that gives them hope, where they can see this is what hope looks like, and I can acknowledge them, be present with them, and have a conversation with them more than just hi, or hopefully knowing their name, but getting to know their name, and then finding something that maybe, what they're wearing, or maybe they have a new item with them, or maybe they're looking like they have a question, and having the time to talk to them. I think that, when we're doing this work, we have to have a healthy work-life balance. We have to practice something, have the strength within ourselves, and hold that hope within ourselves. And I think the question for everybody is, how do you do that for yourself, so when you do come to work, you're coming to work with strength? If you are, playing soccer, you're practicing. Grace talked about how, you practice that. If you're a businessman, you know all the rules. If you're a lawyer, you've studied law.
It makes me think about a couple of things. I find it useful to have some quiet time, definitely, or even at the end of my day, to look back. I actually have a journal that it's one line. I can only fit one sentence in each day, and so it actually is set up so that I can write one line each day for 5 years. And then that page would then be 5 years worth of one-lines. And because I have a toddler and a busy life, we don't always have the time to do a really long journal entry or to really reflect. But just being able to encapsulate my day in one sentence, the good and the bad, really helps me to put that day to bed and to recognize what I'm thankful for, and then what I can work on for the next day.
And you've mentioned a couple things, and Susan brought up two very simple things. Again, small change, big difference, that can help you in being reflective of what's happening. As is mentioned, being mindful and looking at the client, seeing their face, their eyes, their body language can tell you a lot about whether you're connecting with them or not. Listening to their words, listening to the questions they ask, again can tell you a lot about how you're connecting with them. And again, it doesn't take any more time, but it's just that awareness can make a big thing and being reflective and helping us to improve and to grow. Active learning, we've already kind of talked about this, the concept of taking responsibility for my own learning. I've not had the privilege of having any government or anything paying for my learning. I've had to learn all on my own. And so I believe a lot in cross-training, that is reading outside of my field, because sometimes our field's got its problems, and so just reading there, all we read is the same problems. Where do I find solutions? So I read on mediation. I read on creativity. I've been reading a lot recently on resiliency and post-traumatic stress, overcoming post-traumatic stress, because a lot of what they're saying there, I need to work with, because I've been with people who in effect are dealing with post-traumatic stress. So I read on that. That's cross-training. Just like any athlete cross-trains to be more effectively, I cross-train. And a lot of what I do is informal, because I don't have the money to go to the formal stuff. But there's so much now available in books and online But the key, and it's all been brought out, the practice, practice, practice. These people in sports or whatever, they practice until it becomes body memory. And sometimes I meet workers who say, oh yeah, but I've already heard about that. And my question is, have you mastered it? And I want to master the skills that I need to be effective with people and playing with it. Sometimes we just need to have a good time and not make it serious. So I often ask people I work with, what cross-training helps you to be more effective? We were talking earlier, I teach a lot on creativity. I'm helping people be creative. And so I actually practice creativity. I've done many crafts, such as I used to wood carve for many years and did weaving. Now I make copper and silver jewelry. Why? Because it forces my hands to be creative. I cook a lot. I bake. I started last year learning to bake bread, and now I bake all of our bread from scratch with the kneading and the whole stuff. Why? Because by doing that, I'm learning things about the work that I do. I learned how to let things sit for a while sometimes in order for things to process and for ideas to rise and not be in such a hurry. Bread really slows me down when you make bread. It's teaching me to slow down, things like that. And that's something you can think of as well. Adaptive capacity. This is a term used in the education world, a big fancy word. Basically what it means is that you're willing to change. It means that in our changing world, increasingly complex, increasingly difficult situations, we have more and more new situations that are becoming more complex and more chaotic, then we've got to recognize when existing interventions aren't really working and be honest and say they're not working. And I've then got to use all of my knowledge and experience and maybe drawing in from knowledge and experience of those around me to find new answers and new ways. And I may have to create new things, adapt and revise existing, maybe sometimes just improvise at the moment. And it may have to be that I'm working on objectives and content and materials and strategies and assessment, the way I greet people, the way I interview people, all of these things. I may need to say what I've been doing hasn't been working as I'd like it to be, so how can I make it better? And that's that ability to adapt. And we all have that ability. And the idea is that when we face the barriers in life, it's not just that I'm facing that barrier today. Here I am alone by myself facing this struggle. Maybe it's that client before you that you don't have a clue what to do with. Except if I'm here alone, what do I do? The fact is, you're bringing all of your life to that moment. All of your experiences, everything you've learned, all the people you've worked with before, you have all of that experience that right now you have the ability to pour into that moment and say, from all of this, what direction should I do? And maybe you can take something that you've from another part of your life and move it into there. For example, I know about a lot of areas because I've worked in them. And it's surprising how sometimes if I'm struggling with a person and they tell me, oh, I really enjoy sports, well, then I realize I've got to frame everything I'm using in the language of sport because they understand that. And so I draw on my life experience and understanding of sport. If I have somebody who's really into cars, I'll do exactly the same thing. And I'll draw from my life experience and reframe my language, the images, the metaphors I use in their language that they understand. And I can do that at that moment because I'm really not alone. And it's not just that moment. I have a lifetime to bring into that moment. And then creative backswing, this is something we do a lot in the work we do. Very simply what that means is if I ask somebody to do anything, then I have to ask myself, is there something they need to know before they can do that? Because if I don't go back and answer that question, I may be asking them to do something that's just going to set them up for failure because they don't know. For example, this teacher who told me to go to the board and spend an hour and spell my name correctly and keep going, and then another hour after school. The fundamental problem with that was I didn't know how to spell it, and no amount of time playing at that blackboard is going to change the fact I didn't know. She could have taken 5 minutes and taught me how to spell my name. That would have saved me hours of embarrassment and a lifetime of trying to live that down. And so often we have to stop and think, if I'm asking somebody something, I've got to say, wait a minute, for them to do that, well, wait a minute, in order to spell his name, he needs to know how to spell it. Maybe nobody's ever taught him. And sometimes it's way faster if I take that step back and help that person with that. And maybe in your life you found that sometimes the way that you've been able to go forward is you took the time to take a few steps back, learn something, pick something up, try something differently, and then move forward. And a few improv principles that we can talk about that are really helpful. This is the first principle that I teach in a lot of improv courses. There's a lot of stuff online about teaching improv, and a lot of it really we can use in our field. And this first one is the activity called yes and. And very simply what they use with this, if you've ever watched comedy improv, somebody will say something, and the comedian can't say, oh, I don't like that. Tell me something else.
Why don't we just try that right now?
Yeah, well, let me just move ahead to that.
Sure.
We'll throw that out, the yes and. Just that what we want to do is say yes and, not yes but. And be open to whatever comes. I have to hear what the person says. And instead of saying, oh, I don't like that, I accept that's where that person's at. But how can I build on that? And I take it as it comes and have a can-do attitude. So yes and, yes but. And let's try it with this one here. And Sarah and I are going to try this. And we're going to start with a yes but first. And this is how they train somebody. They say, and I do this with clients all the time. It's amazing the response after I do this activity with them. So this time I'm going to start, and I'll be the client, and I'll say something, and Sarah's going to say yes but. Then I'm going to respond by giving another yes but. We're just going to go back and forth a few times. Okay? So Sarah, I think it'd be a great idea to talk with somebody at Housing First.
Yes, but are you sure that you have all the paperwork you need to start that?
Yeah, but if I don't have the paperwork, then they probably won't want to help me, so it'd be a real waste of time, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but it takes practice, people. But also, do you even know when they're open?
No. Yeah, I think it'd be a great idea, but I don't know when they're open. I don't know where they are. I don't know how I'd get there. You know, so maybe it's just not worth the effort.
So you can see how this could really quickly spiral into something that would be the opposite of hope-filled engagement. Right?
And it spirals down. Mm-hmm. And maybe you hear a lot of yes buts.
I do. Gray, why don't we try the opposite of with Susan here?
Okay. Yes,
so why don't you guys go for it?
Why don't you two do this?
All right.
So one of
improv. We're doing improv.
So now every person has to answer by saying yes and build on what that person has said.
Okay.
And are you going to be the client? Or?
Sure, I'll be the client. I think it would be a great idea to go talk to someone at Housing First.
Yes, and first of all, I'd like to give you some information about what Housing First can do.
Oh, yes. And do you know when they're open and how I could get there? I don't really have any bus fare.
Yes, and they're open. Actually, there's multiple points of entry. There's many different places where you can actually get the service. And I think that there's some supports that will really help you to access it.
Yes, and are you sure they're going to see me?
Well, you know, there is some criteria, but I think we can look at what it is, and we can also find other resources. If it doesn't fit perfectly, it's a first step, and we can move forward.
I feel really encouraged by that. And as Gray will probably point out here, there's a lot of ands in there. And so but is kind of this thing that stops you.
It is. It's hard.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard sounding word, but and kind of, it's open to possibility.
Yeah, and this is very effective. It's really a form of, if we go back, we talked about living with the whirlwind of the problem or living with possibilities in reality. One says, yes, but I can't because, and the other one says, yeah, and I could do this, you know, for some reason. And we have to be careful, even when this, because a client may come and say something difficult. They may say to you, oh, I don't think I could get there on time. And you say, yeah, but so-and-so. You see, right away, as soon as we put that but, they may feel like we're shutting down because we said but. But if you say, yeah, I understand that. I'm building on what they're saying. I'm accepting that that's their reality. I understand that that can be difficult, and I think we can find some way to help you get there.
So if I could, I'd like to use another scenario, because a lot of the people out there listening today are working with people who are homeless. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you might be wanting to engage with somebody who they might come to a drop-in, or you might be actually an outreach worker where you're having to walk along the street and you see somebody kind of half sleeping, half not sleeping. They look like they might need a little bit of medical attention, maybe a few Band-Aids. They might have some, you know, scratches, or they look like they've had a rough night. You know, how do you use the yes ands and the yes buts just to even start that conversation?
Well, what I try to do with the yes and is, the key is you're accepting things as they are and building with that in realistic what's possible at the next step. And so if I'm meeting somebody, for example, who may be lying in the street and not fully coherent, then I have to be realistic, go back to the being realistic about what my first step is. But sometimes we feel the pressure that our first step has got to be way down the road where the person isn't yet. So I've got to accept that and say, this person can only do this. I accept that, and I say, okay, what can we do right now with where that person is at? And it may not be much more than getting a person's name or being able to help them to, you know, maybe walk them to somewhere where they can, you know, get a sandwich or something. I'm just saying that part of this, a lot of it is the acceptance of where the person's at instead of the buts where, but there's all these problems. And so depending upon where the person's at, that may influence. I had one example where I was working on a reserve in the province, and it was a small group, and I would spend 4 days with these social assistance recipients, and one was autistic gentleman. And he was very nonverbal, having a difficult time with everything, but he was required to be there by a social worker. He'd lose his social assistance, and he was in his 20s. And so when it came to the part where we had people say, what are some of your favorite things? We're going to find where they're engaged. This young man was very, he didn't do a lot. And the only thing he could think of that he enjoyed doing was at 3 o'clock every weekday, he walked down to the corner and met his niece and nephew when they got off the school bus. He walked then home with them to their home, and he sat with them till Mom and Dad came home, and he watched them play. This was, he didn't read, he didn't, and so he told this story. And I remember talking with the worker after, who was so excited because she said, it may not seem a lot, but this is the first time I've heard him talk. That's a yes and. Mm-hmm. This is where he's at. She says, we've never been able to get him to talk before. Well, that's because they're asking him to talk about stuff he wasn't interested in, right? But helping his niece and nephew was something meaningful. So it can be as practical to yes and as realizing that there may be only one very small first step I can take. For another person, I don't know how far that will build. That one person may be, I can remember, yes and to me is like the aha moments. And a few years ago, and those Courage to Come Back Awards, the story of that man who had been on the East End for years, and his brother and 2 sons, young boys, saw him on TV. I don't know if you saw that. And you know how they highlight sometimes the street. And this man saw his brother there, lying on the street on the TV news, and he said to his sons, "That's my brother." And his boy says, "Well, we want to meet our uncle." So he said, "Oh, I don't know." They said, "No, we want to meet him." So they went down the next Saturday and found him in an alley in downtown Vancouver East End here. And they went up to him and he said, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm your brother. He'd been 17 years on the street. And that man said, these are your nephews. They want to meet you. And that man said, that did something to me. And he got up, he entered a program, changed his life. Now he's got a job, he's married, he's working. And see, they went to where he was, accepted him as he was, and he may have been somebody whose life was really struggling, but his began with those two nephews who wanted to know him. And we never know what that end will lead us to. That's hope. Mm-hmm. So I reach out in that moment, try to add something positive, try to build on that, because I don't know how far that's going to go. And that, to me, is why it's so powerful, because it's really putting us on a new road, and only time will tell me where that road will go. And does that help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Being present, we've already talked about this, that the fact we've got to do the present moment, pay attention, listen, and this is a challenge, working with present realities. It's so easy when we interact with people to have in our mind all the things we think we should be saying, all the things we're supposed to be filling out, us doing, and not paying attention to the person and finding where they're at. No mistakes, only opportunities is a big one, because when we do this, I may say something wrong, and I do many times because I'm human. But what I do is I take it, and I find one of the greatest things I can do to create relationship with the people I work with is to admit to them that I'm human like they are. I'm not some big fancy person who's got everything together. I also have my issues, my struggle. I make my mistakes, and I just laugh with it, no matter what it is. And I can make a lot of mistakes. I can remember one time speaking at a conference where I actually, walking around, didn't notice the edge of the stage and fell off. I made a big clutter because I became invisible. And I got up and just kind of shared how my propensity to do klutzy things in my life. And I find with clients, just being honest about mistakes, it just puts me at the same level as them, and I need that. And I don't play alone. The reality of relationships and all that, and having fun. I try to bring fun into most of my activities. I've had problems where people have complained when I've done workshops with clients because they've been too noisy, they've been having too much fun. Now, you don't expect that when you're doing career workshops, but it can be done. Because you know what? I find people learn differently, listen differently if they're having fun. Just talking over a cup of coffee changes the way people interact, having fun. And this quickly, in the last few minutes, because we won't have time for questions, I want to say I've been asked to talk a little bit about questioning. I use questioning a lot, and using different questions. Questions are like stimuli, because questions point us to things. And the questions I ask will point people in different directions. And sometimes I have to ask questions outside the box. I often illustrate with some work by Richard Wilde. He teaches in the area of graphic design, and when he first started teaching, he found that his students were boring and ho-hum and uncreative because all their answers were bland and in the box, and he couldn't figure out why these people were so boring. After a couple of years, he realized the problem was that he was asking questions in the box. He was asking boring questions, so he got boring answers. It wasn't that they were boring, it's that he was. And so what he started doing was asking questions outside the box. And as soon as he started doing that, people didn't have predetermined answers, and so he started getting all creative answers. And I often say to counselors when I'm meeting them, you have this client who's been on the system for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. How many times have they gone into an office and been asked exactly the same questions, visit after visit after visit? And then they tell me, yeah, lots of time. And how many times do you find that they appear to be answering you with the way the answer they know you want? Why? Because they've done it dozens of times. And we wonder why it goes down the same path. It's like going to a water slide where there's all those tubes at the end. If you enter tube A, you're going to end up at the bottom of tube A. You're not going to end up at the bottom of C, D, or E, right? And so what I have to do is ask questions and do things that they don't expect. Because if they don't expect it, they're not predetermined. And it's surprising the freshness that comes with that. Sometimes I use mind your P's and Q's. Mary Lee Adams in her book Change Your Questions, Change Your Life does this when she talks about people asking questions that just point to the negative, the difficult, the problems. What's wrong with me? Why can't I get off the street? Why is the world out to get me? What's the point of trying? Where do all those questions point? They all point to what's wrong. They don't help a person see new possibilities. And it's easy, again, to be around and around those. But all these questions really point to the story a person is saying about themselves. It's talking about the perspectives they have. It's talking about the questions they're asking themselves. And her position in Change Your Questions, Change Your Life is what happens if I change those questions? Instead of saying, what's wrong with me? What's right with me? That man who's been on the street for years, it's easy to say, what's wrong with me? But what's right with a man who's able to discipline his life every day to go out for hours, to follow a systematic route, to do the hard work, the challenging work of collecting what he collects, etc. There's a lot of rightness there, if it can be seen. Instead of saying, why can't I go to the street, what could I do to find and keep housing? That's a different question, points in a different direction. Who's trying to support me? Points to something different. Why do I want to try? How do I want my world to be? These questions change. Another thing is what we call the spiral of curiosity and discovery. And this is how questioning conversations take place, where we ask something, we see something. That causes us to ask something else. Every child does this. You ask a child a question, they ask you a question, you answer it, they're going to say, why? You answer that, they're going to say, why? And they'll keep doing that till eventually you say, don't ask again, that's enough. But this is used all throughout, the world and all kinds of areas, and it's used in every conversation we do. We ask questions, people tell us things, we ask again. And it's certainly used in the career field, it's what we do in your field, where we get to know people who they are, we get them to tell their stories, we get them to think about where they are in their life, the decisions they're making, etc. And just one quick example, facilitated storyteller. What is one of your favorite things? The person says, I enjoy hiking, and you find you have a skill. Many times when we facilitate our conversations, people stop there. They found something out, and that's the end of it. But really, that's the beginning of a journey of discovery with that person. It's like that, yes, and you keep building on it. And so if the person enjoys hiking, I can say, well, that's not just this. What do you enjoy about hiking? The person says, I love the outdoors. I've got another interest. What do you love about the outdoors? I think it's important to find peace and quiet. Now I find something that's important, of value. And then I ask the person, what's important about finding peace and quiet? The person says, I need time to be alone and think. Now I've got how they deal with balance. Now I've got how they cope. What kind of things do you think about? Just about sorting out some of my problems. Now I've learned a coping skill. And we call this second-order questioning. That is, instead of stopping at the first answer, use that yes and, that build on that, explore that. And it's amazing what you can cover in a person by the time you've done this a few times. And this is a very wonderful way to get to know people in a much more deeper way. I'm asking questions they don't expect because I'm talking about their favorite things rather than their problems. And then I keep building on what they've shared.
I just want to get maybe one or two sentences from Susan about what you learned today and a parting thought you want to leave with our listeners, as well as for you, Gray. One last thing you want to leave. Susan.
Well, I know that one of my big drivers were to get people more training on motivational interviewing or inspirational interviewing, and many of them have had some training in that. I think breaking it down into these forms that we can actually work on, and sometimes, when you talk about being present or you talk about holding hope so that you can also help others see hope and look at those threads using the ands, asking the questions. It seems like a softer technique, but it's very effective. And I really like what Gray has said around, the smallest change can have huge impact. And I hope that that's what people take away today, is that they actually can build on those concepts.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And I'm going to jump forward to a slide. As we mentioned, we can't get to everything because of the time we have, and I had a bunch of little practical things that you can look at and think about your own. But this is a quote I used from Albert Schweitzer, who was a German doctor, leader, and he was also ended up going to Africa and became somebody who worked with the desperate poor in Africa. He got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. But I love this quote by him because I think it sets what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to help the workers that I train to be able to do, and also the clients that I work with. To the question of whether I'm a pessimist or an optimist, I answer that my knowledge is pessimistic, but my willing and hoping are optimistic. I know that we work in a field, when we work with multivariate people, where there are very real, difficult problems that have no quick, simple, easy solution. I know that there's more than enough reasons to be pessimistic and to sit around and talk about all the problems that we have, because these are realities and there's no getting around that. But I believe that there's more than those problems, and there's more that we can do than complain about them. And so I choose, as it says, to have my willing and hoping to be optimistic, because I believe we can reach to something beyond the problems that are here now, and as we do that, we can help our clients reach to new things. And I walk into each situation not knowing how far this journey is going to go, but I believe it is possible for people to go infinitely further than often we can ask or imagine. And so thank you for listening to this.
I just want to say thank you to both of you for your wisdom, your lived experience, your willingness to do a little bit of improv with us today. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you leave this session feeling hopeful, feeling encouraged, and knowing that we actually can make a difference, even in the smallest of things. So have a peaceful day, and we'll see you again soon.